killing hundreds and possibly thousands of unarmed civilians in Beijing. Many were Chinese students who had been peacefully protesting for reform, democratic transparency, and respect for fundamental human rights. But victims included young children and people in their 60s cut down by indiscriminate gunfire. The dramatic days of May and June 1989 left the world with many indelible images. The huge expanse of Tiananmen Square packed with hundreds of thousands of people rallying for freedom. The 30-foot-tall goddess of democracy statue built by Beijing art students in the center of the square. The rush of tanks and armored personnel carriers into the area to quite literally crush the protest and protesters on June the 4th. The heroism the next day of someone the world only knows as the Tank Man, who halted an entire column of Chinese army tanks, armed only with shopping bags and a resolve. But those indelible images are hidden from the people of China by the communist regime that inherited the bloody mantle of Tiananmen. Hiding behind the Great Firewall, the Chinese government refuses to allow any reckoning with that history and fiercely quashes discussion, whether online or in public. Obsessed with control, it uses its massive Orwellian apparatus to try to erase the events of June 1989 from the memory of the world. But as John Adams once wrote, facts are stubborn things. So too are the memories of the many Chinese who experienced those events up close. Western journalists on the ground during the massacre reported that people
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I thank Chairman McCall for his eloquent statement and his leadership on this issue, and I rise in very strong support of this measure. 30 years ago, the Chinese government has tried to erase memory human rights, what you're doing on trade, what you're doing in the South China Sea. All of them are of a piece. They are an effort by the Chinese government to break free and to rewrite the rules that keep the world safe and free. And we see the Chinese government's attempt to silence us on these issues for what it is, a sign of weakness, not of strength. The Chinese government's power rests on a fragile foundation of falsehood. It depends on people forgetting the past. It depends on people believing a lie. So today we say, you are failing, and you are going to fail. It's been 30 years. We still mark this anniversary. We still remember Liu Xiaobo and all the heroes of the square. The footage of Tank Man still plays on TV, and thanks to the internet, more people are seeing it today than saw it in 1989. We will carry on until we know his name, until the Chinese people have the freedom that they fought peacefully for that day and that they so richly deserve. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield so much time as he may consume. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Perry.
The gentleman
I
is
thank the
recognized.
ranking member. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today, I'm in support of this resolution on the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen Square Massacre. And I thank Rep. McGovern and Rep. Smith for their leadership on this resolution, which serves to remember the victims of the violent suppression of democracy protests in Tiananmen Square in 1989 and calls on the current communist government of China to respect the universally recognized human rights of all people living in China and around the world. I just remember as a young man watching this whole, as probably many of the people do, this whole thing unfold on our television sets, and we were rooting. We were rooting for these people yearning to breathe free, and the man standing in front of the tank. It's just emblazoned in our minds. 30 years ago, in the spring of 1989, thousands of Chinese students began staging peaceful protests for democratic reforms in China. They were asking their communist government for rights that are fundamental to any democracy, including freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and the elimination of official corruption. They were asking for rights and freedoms that we enjoy in the United States, but the Chinese citizens were being denied then, and believe it or not, are still being denied today, regardless of what you see on television, regardless of what you might think because it says made in China. Things are different in China. When faced with the growing and intensifying peaceful protests, the communist leaders in 1989 chose a violent and authoritarian response and then lied about it, acted like it didn't happen. They chose to declare martial law and to intensify their use of authoritarian tactics to oppress and control the people of China, culminating in the events in Tiananmen Square. On June 4th of 1989, 10 to 15,000 soldiers in armored columns of tanks outside Tiananmen Square fired directly at Chinese citizens and indiscriminately at crowds in Beijing, inflicting high civilian casualties. These are unarmed crowds. Or forcibly interned in detention camps interference with privacy, physical attacks on criminal prosecution of journalists, lawyers, writers, bloggers, dissidents, petitioners, and their family members, interference with the rights of peaceful assembly against China's aggressive and authoritarian actions, not only to their own people, but to the rest of the world, including the United States. And I would hope that we would not only support this president and this administration when he does the right thing, taking a hard stance against China, but that this Congress will take the lead on concrete actions regarding China's malevolent behavior around the world, but particularly in China with their markets, with dumping on American markets, with intellectual property theft, and the list goes on and on and on. With that, Madam Speaker, Mr. Chairman, I yield.
The gentleman.
Cities throughout China. We remember with sadness and outrage the crackdown that followed as the People's Liberation Army was unleashed on its own people. One of the most inspiring images in history is the lone man standing in the street before the line of tanks on Tiananmen Square. His act of resistance symbolizes the spirit of Tiananmen that lives on in the hearts and minds of those continuing the struggle in China and abroad. In China, the Tiananmen Mothers is a group of relatives and friends of those killed in June 1989. At great risk to themselves, they continue to ask for the right to mourn publicly and call for a full public and independent accounting of the victims. The Chinese government fears their memory, their devotion, and their moral standing. In the years since Tiananmen, the human rights situation in China has worsened. Some have described a slow-motion Tiananmen happening in Xinjiang with the ongoing mass internment and surveillance of ethnic Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims. A better path forward was offered by Nobel Peace Prize laureate and Tiananmen student leader Liu Xiaobo when he co-authored the Political Reform Manifesto Charter 08 that was signed by more than 10,000 people despite efforts to censor it. Liu Xiaobo spent a total of almost 16 years in prison, and he died in state custody in 2017. Today in China, the Tiananmen Square Massacre is erased from history books, and any mention of it is censored. In the last few weeks, the Chinese government has tightened controls to prevent any mention of Tiananmen and heightened surveillance on the survivors, human rights advocates, and their families. They have detained journalists, scholars, filmmakers, social workers, and labor rights activists. But we all know that the spirit of Tiananmen is still alive and well. We know in part because China's leaders demonstrate their fear of it every day with their security cameras, their censorship, detention centers, and obsession with preventing the people of China from learning the truth. Imagine the time and energy and cost of monitoring and tracking the actions of 1.4 billion people. They are scared because the truth of Tiananmen threatens the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy to govern China. In his famous last statement in court before he was sentenced, Liu Xiaobo said, and I quote, "I look forward to the day when my country is a land with freedom of expression, where the speech of every citizen will be treated equally well, where different values, ideas, beliefs, and political views can both compete with each other and peacefully coexist, where both majority and minority views will be equally guaranteed, and where the political views that differ from those currently in power will be fully respected and protected, where all political views will spread out under the sun for people to choose from, where every citizen can state political views without fear, and where no one can, under any circumstances, suffer political persecution for voicing divergent political views. I hope that I will be the last victim in China's long record of treating words as crimes. No force can block the thirst for freedom that lies within human nature, and someday China, too, will be a nation of laws where human rights are paramount." End quote. I look forward to that day, Madam Speaker. And let us pass this bill with a strong vote. Let us make it clear that we in the United States Congress stand out loud and foursquare for human rights, and that we stand with the people of China. I thank the gentleman. I yield back my time.
I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'm prepared to close.
The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I must say, at a time when the American people see this Congress so divided, it's refreshing for the American people to see the Congress so united, with one voice, standing up for good over evil. We must keep the memory of Tiananmen alive. As Secretary Pompeo said yesterday, China's one-party state tolerates no dissent and abuses human rights wherever and whenever it serves its interests. Today, their party's methods are more subtle than rolling tanks in, but no less horrifying. The Communist Party deprives 1/5 of mankind of fundamental human rights. It has imprisoned up to 3 million Muslims in what the Department of Defense has called and labeled concentration camps, and is seeking to spread its totalitarian ideology and repression along its physical and digital One Belt, One Road initiative. In the Foreign Affairs Committee, I know I and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will keep working to shine a light on China's threats, impose consequences on their malign actions, foster partnerships with NATO and other allies, and help build up an alternative to China's predatory Belt and Road influence. So with that, I urge my colleagues to support this resolution, to honor the memory of those who have sacrificed for freedom, and to remain clear-eyed about the nature of our adversary. And with that, Madam Speaker, I yield back.
Yields back. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume for the purpose of closing. And I will simply say that our disagreement here